I always thought family was my safe haven, until the night I came home from work and found my children's belongings dumped into the basement. My parents smiled and said, "Our other grandson deserves the best rooms." My kids cried, their little voices breaking, and I froze, not in weakness, but in revelation. That moment shattered everything I believed about loyalty and blood. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just whispered, "Pack your bags." What they didn't know was that behind my silence, I had already begun a plan that would tear their empire of lies apart forever. It was always around 2 in the morning when my phone rang. That night was no different. My mother's name lit up on the screen, and before I even answered, my chest tightened. I already knew what she would say. When I picked up, her voice carried that practiced tremble, the one designed to trigger guilt. "Emily, we need medicine. Your father isn't feeling well. Get here now." I was sitting at my desk, my laptop glowing with the unfinished report my boss expected by sunrise. My hands trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion. Still, I closed the laptop, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the freezing night. This was what family meant, wasn't it? Sacrifices, responsibilities, loyalty. That's what I'd been told since childhood. Blood comes first. Everything else is secondary. The drive was silent except for the low hum of my engine and the pounding in my head. Tears blurred my vision, not from sadness but from sheer fatigue. I wiped them quickly before they froze on my cheeks. I remember thinking, why do I always feel like a child again whenever they call? 35 years old, 2 children of my own, and still one late-night call from my mother could snap me into obedience. I told myself it was love, but deep down, I knew it was something darker. When I arrived, my parents barely glanced at me. They had already taken the medicine from my hands before I could set it down. "Took you long enough," my father muttered, flipping channels on the television. My mother was on her phone, scrolling as if I were nothing more than a delivery service. I stood there for a moment, shivering in the doorway, until my mother finally waved me off. "You can go now, don't wake the children." Driving back, I felt hollow. It wasn't the request itself, it was the entitlement, the certainty that I would come no matter what. I thought about the countless times they'd said, "Family always shows up," but what they really meant was, "You show up for us. We don't have to show up for you." That was the unspoken rule. I reached home at 3:30 a.m., kissed my sleeping kids on the forehead, and sat in the dark living room. My laptop was still open on the table, the cursor blinking accusingly on the unfinished report. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, to stop answering their calls. But instead, I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and whispered to myself, "It's fine, this is what daughters do." I didn't know then that this was only the beginning, the first thread in a web that would eventually strangle me. The signs were always there, but they came disguised as small things. My parents had a way of packaging cruelty in casual wrapping, making it seem harmless. They constantly compared me to others, especially to my sister's son, their so-called golden grandchild. At family dinners, my mother would sigh dramatically and say, "If only Emily could be more like Sarah's boy. Straight A's, polite, a real credit to the family." I would laugh it off, pretending it didn't sting. But my children heard every word. I saw the way their faces fell, the way their shoulders hunched as though they too were less than. Then there were the conversations I wasn't supposed to know about. the group chats my parents created with relatives, where I was the punchline. I discovered them accidentally one day when my cousin showed me a screenshot. They mocked my career, belittled my parenting, laughed at my struggles. Emily tries so hard, poor thing. Maybe if she were smarter, she wouldn't be alone. The words cut deeper than any blade. My parents had always said, "We only want the best for you." But behind closed doors, they celebrated my failures. Sometimes the memories hit me unexpectedly, like the night I drove home from their house after another round of subtle insults. I remembered standing in my high school gym, clutching my diploma, scanning the crowd for their faces. They never came. "We were busy," they'd said later, as if missing one of the most important nights of my life was nothing. That old ache resurfaced, sharper now that I had children of my own, because if they could so easily erase me, what would stop them from erasing my kids too? That thought haunted me as I tucked my children into bed, brushing hair from their damp cheeks after they cried themselves to sleep over another weekend at Grandma's. I kissed them good night and whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I wanted to protect them, to shield them from the same cycle of disappointment I'd endured. But even then, I didn't yet realize how close we were to the breaking point. I thought I could endure their words, their comparisons, their midnight demands. I thought I could be the buffer between my parents' toxicity and my children's innocence. But I was wrong, because the day was coming when my parents would show me that they weren't just willing to belittle me. They were ready to cast my children aside without hesitation. And when that day came, it wouldn't be my diploma they ignored, or my career they mocked. It would be my kids they shoved into the shadows, abandoned, humiliated, and made to feel invisible. I didn't know it then, but the first time I answered that call at 2 a.m. was also the first time I let them take control of my life completely. The day it all snapped wasn't extraordinary. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday where you go to work, drown in deadlines, and look forward to the simple joy of coming home to your children. I remember humming softly in the car, a small attempt to push away the exhaustion clinging to my body. But the moment I stepped inside the house, the air shifted. Silence hung heavy, too still, too sharp. And then I heard it, soft sobs echoing from below. I rushed to the basement door, heart pounding. There they were, my children, curled up on old mattresses, their belongings scattered across the damp floor, their clothes still folded, their toys dumped like garbage, their books stacked crookedly against the wall. Their faces were red, streaked with tears. My youngest clutched his backpack to his chest as though it were the last thing keeping him safe. I froze. My legs trembled. My hands went cold. My children looked up at me, their eyes wide with confusion and hurt. My daughter whispered, "Grandma said these rooms weren't ours anymore. She said we don't deserve them." And then, from upstairs, I heard my mother's voice, calm and self-assured, like she was announcing the weather. "Our other grandson deserves the best rooms. He needs the space more than they do." At that moment, something inside me fractured. Rage surged through me, white hot, shaking me from the inside out. My pulse hammered, my jaw clenched, but then, unexpectedly, I went still. My breath slowed. The fury froze into something sharper, colder. I looked at my crying children, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. I felt awake. If it were you, standing there, staring at your children, exiled to the basement while the people who raised you justified it with a smile. What would you have done? Would you scream? Would you collapse? Or would you, like me, feel the silence settle deep into your bones and realize this was no longer about obedience or even about respect? This was war. I bent down, wiped the tears from my children's cheeks, and whispered, "Pack your bags." They stared at me, confused, but I smiled. Not a smile of forgiveness, not a smile of surrender. A smile that said, "I see you now, and you will never hurt us again." My parents didn't understand it then, but that was the last night they would hold power over me. I tucked my kids into the car that evening and drove them to a friend's house, promising them it was only temporary. They clung to me, still shaking, but I assured them, "This isn't forever. I'll fix this." And for the first time, I meant it. The next morning, I combed through my finances, exhausted but focused. That's when the second betrayal hit me. Line after line on my credit card statement showed transactions I hadn't made. Purchases for expensive electronics, clothes, even furniture. My parents had been using my card, and when I traced where the items went, my stomach turned. All of it had been funneled into setting up the golden grandchild's perfect little world upstairs. The rooms my children were forced out of were filled with gifts I unknowingly paid for. I sat at my kitchen table, the receipts spread out like battlefield maps. My hands shook, but this time it wasn't from despair. It was from clarity. Every lie they had told, every manipulation, every midnight call, it all clicked together. They hadn't just stolen my time or my energy. They had stolen my children's dignity, and they had done it with my own money. I walked into my kids' room that night, knelt beside them, and pulled them into my arms. They were asleep, their faces finally calm, but I whispered into the quiet, "I promise you will never grow up thinking this is normal. I won't let you inherit my silence." Tears blurred my vision, but they weren't the tears of weakness I once knew. They were the tears of a woman who had finally chosen to stop enduring and start fighting. The next day, I bought a small notebook. On the first page, I wrote one word: receipts. I began documenting everything: the calls, the comments, the transactions. I downloaded a recording app, testing it under my breath. I knew the law well enough to stay cautious, but I also knew that sometimes the truth had to be preserved, no matter the method. Each entry, each screenshot, each hidden recording felt like a weapon sharpened. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm back to confront them. I smiled in front of them, nodded, even played along. Because in silence, I was building something far stronger than anger, strategy. I used to be their victim. But in that moment, with a pen, scratching across paper, and my children safe under my roof, I crossed a threshold. I had become something they never anticipated. I became a strategist. And as I pressed record for the very first time, listening to the faint hum of my mother's voice in the background, I whispered to myself, "This is where the game begins." The first thing I did was stop reacting. Every time my parents called, every time they tossed a jab, I forced myself to stay calm. Not because I forgave them, but because I needed them to believe I was still under control. While they smirked, thinking I was broken, I was quietly turning my home into an evidence lab. I started with my phone. Screenshots of text messages where my mother belittled my children. Recordings of calls where my father demanded money, threatening me with guilt if I refused. I combed through my credit card statements, printing out every unexplained charge. The pile on my desk grew higher, page after page, proof of years of manipulation. One evening, exhausted, I scrolled through my parents' emails, ones they had carelessly left open on a shared device years ago. I shouldn't have had access, but desperation often blurs the line between right and wrong. That's when I found it. A message chain with their lawyer. My heart slammed against my ribs as I read. They were revising their will. My name wasn't anywhere. Everything, house, savings, land, was being redirected to my sister and her son, the golden grandchild. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the money, it was the erasure. My parents weren't just choosing favorites, they were cutting me out of the family story altogether, as if I had never existed. I wanted to scream, but instead I folded the printed pages neatly and slid them into my notebook labeled receipts. My hands shook, but my voice stayed steady. That night, I sat in my car outside the house. My kids were inside, waiting for dinner. I turned on the radio, finding the song my daughter always sang along to. For 10 minutes, I let myself pretend everything was normal. I tapped the steering wheel, hummed the tune, even laughed softly when I remembered her little voice hitting the wrong notes. It was a fragile bubble of peace, and I clung to it, because soon I knew that bubble would burst. I whispered to the empty car, "This is not forever. I will rewrite this story." But the truth was, I didn't have to do it alone. The unexpected ally arrived in the form of my Aunt Claire, my mother's sister, a woman who had always lingered at the edges of family gatherings with a knowing look. She called me one afternoon, her voice low. "Emily, you need to see something." She sent me screenshots from a group chat I hadn't known existed. A group chat where my parents and several relatives mocked me openly. They called me weak, a burden, even questioned if my kids were worth the trouble. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting. But then I saw something I didn't expect. My sister's son, the golden grandchild, was in the chat too. His messages were rare, short, but one of them stood out. He had written, "I don't want this. Stop making me into something I'm not." I sat frozen, staring at the words. The boy I had resented, the one who supposedly had everything, didn't want it either. He was just a child caught in their web, forced to play the role they'd written for him. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. My anger at my parents burned hotter, not colder. Because their poison hadn't only seeped into me, it had infected him too. That night, I tucked my children into bed, watching their tiny hands clutch the blankets. I thought of my nephew, probably lying awake in his new perfect room upstairs, burdened with expectations he never asked for. I hated what my parents had done to me, but I hated even more that they had turned children into pawns in their twisted game. I whispered to my sleeping kids, "You will never be pawns, not ever." The plan was no longer just about revenge. It was about survival, about breaking a cycle so deep it had swallowed generations before me. I knew my parents thought they had me cornered. They thought loyalty was my cage. But with every screenshot, every receipt, every whispered confession, I was building my way out. The final straw came in another late-night message from Aunt Claire. It was a photo of a Christmas invitation, my parents hosting their usual grand holiday dinner. She added one line beneath it, "This is your stage." I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse quickening. Christmas. The night when every relative would be present. The night when my parents would flaunt their golden grandchild, parade their perfect image. The night they expected me to sit quietly, smile, and endure. I closed the phone and leaned back in my chair, feeling the quiet thrum of destiny in my chest. I knew, just one more Christmas. And then the truth would tear their empire apart. The night of Christmas arrived with its usual artificial glow. The house smelled of roasted meat, cinnamon candles, and expensive wine. Laughter spilled from the living room, where relatives gathered, exchanging gifts wrapped in red and gold. My parents floated among them like royalty, their smiles sharp, their voices louder than everyone else's, as if volume itself could prove superiority. They hadn't noticed me much when I arrived. Perhaps they thought I was beaten into silence, ready to sit in the corner and watch their empire shine. But in my bag sat a stack of carefully prepared envelopes. Each one contained screenshots, receipts, recordings, truth in black and white. Instead of exploding in one dramatic announcement, I decided to hand out the truth quietly, strategically. One by one, I slipped the envelopes into the hands of aunts, uncles, cousins. Confusion flickered in their eyes as they opened them, eyes darting back and forth between the papers and the hosts of the night. Whispering started in one corner, then spread like fire. My parents noticed. My mother's laugh grew sharper. My father's hand tightened around his glass. "What's all this?" my mother demanded, trying to keep her voice calm. No one answered. They were too busy reading the words she had typed, the things she had said behind closed doors. Every insult, every manipulation, every theft. It was all there. For a brief moment, I faltered. My palms were sweating, my knees weak. I thought about retreating, about stuffing the rest of the evidence back into my bag. Then I felt a small hand slip into mine. My daughter looked up at me, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but firm. "Mom, we're with you." The tremor in my body stilled. I nodded to her, then reached into my bag for the final piece, a small USB drive. I plugged it into the projector that had been set up for holiday photos. Instead of images of smiling grandchildren, the screen filled with text messages. My mother's mocking words, my father's demands for money, my nephew's forced role as their golden child. The room went silent. Forks froze midair. Wine glasses hovered, untouched. The only sound was the steady scroll of damning evidence across the wall. And then came the first crack. My father slammed his glass onto the table. "This is taken out of context," he barked. My mother clutched her chest, her voice trembling now. "She's lying. She manipulated all this. We've done nothing but sacrifice for her." But their voices were weak against the evidence flashing across the wall, against the papers in everyone's hands, against the years of truth finally finding its voice. Then, unexpectedly, another voice broke the tension. My nephew, the golden grandchild, stood up. His hands shook, his face pale, but his words cut sharper than any blade. "I don't want this," he said. "I never wanted to be the favorite. They made me. They told me to play along. They said if I didn't, I'd lose everything." Gasps rippled through the room. My parents turned to him, shock twisting their faces. "Stop it," my mother hissed, but he didn't. He looked straight at me, his eyes filled with shame and relief all at once. "I'm sorry, Aunt Emily. I didn't want to hurt you or my cousins. I didn't have a choice." For a moment, the room was utterly still. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was heavy, thick, suffocating. My parents' carefully built illusion was crumbling right in front of them, not just from my evidence, but from the very child they had weaponized. I looked around the table at the stunned faces of relatives, their silence louder than any accusation. For the first time, they weren't looking at me with pity or judgment. They were looking at my parents with horror. The weight of the moment settled over me. I could have stopped there. I could have let the silence serve as punishment. But I had one last card to play, something they would never recover from. I leaned forward, my voice calm, almost gentle. This isn't everything. And as every pair of eyes turned toward me, I felt the power shift completely. Because I still had a final truth they didn't know was coming. A truth that would strip away not only their reputation, but the last shred of control they thought they had. And when I revealed it, they would never lift their heads again. The fallout from Christmas did not end at the dining table. The very next week, I sat across from a lawyer, my notebook of receipts spread wide across his polished desk. He examined the evidence with a measured calm, nodding as he flipped through page after page. "Emily," he said, "you have more than enough here. Financial exploitation, unauthorized use of funds, misappropriation. It's not just family drama, it's fraud." The word struck me like a thunderclap. Fraud. My parents hadn't just hurt me emotionally, they had committed crimes. Together, the lawyer and I mapped out a case. Every unauthorized charge, every bank transfer, every forged signature, it all painted a picture too damning to ignore. For years, they had siphoned my money, not just for themselves, but to build the gilded world of their golden grandchild. And now the law had its teeth in them. News spread quickly. In small towns, reputations travel faster than fire. When the church board discovered the allegations, they moved swiftly. My father had been a respected member, a man who wore his faith like armor. But when confronted with receipts and legal papers, the board had no choice. They stripped him of his position, distancing themselves from the scandal. The charities my mother boasted of, supporting quietly cut ties as well. Invitations stopped arriving, friends stopped calling. Their empire of influence crumbled brick by brick. I should have felt triumphant, and part of me did. But one night, standing alone on my balcony, the weight of it all finally pressed down. 30 years of manipulation, of running when they called, of bending myself to their will. It all came rushing back. I sank to the cold floor, my shoulders shaking as sobs tore free. Not the delicate tears of exhaustion, but deep, guttural cries that rattled my chest. For once there was no mask, no strategy, just me, broken open. I cried for the child they ignored, for the woman they ridiculed, for the mother whose children had been made to feel less. I cried until the stars blurred above me, and when the last tear slipped away, I whispered into the night. I thought I had won, but maybe, just maybe, I've only just begun to live. Days turned into weeks, and something unexpected began to happen. My story rippled outward. Relatives who had always stayed silent started to speak. Cousins called me, confessing the times my parents had manipulated them too. One aunt stood up at a gathering and said aloud what no one else dared. They built their reputation on lies. The silence that once suffocated me now suffocated them. My parents no longer walked into rooms with their heads high. They avoided rooms altogether. The satisfaction wasn't in watching them fall, it was in watching the truth rise. My children walked taller, freer. They saw their mother not as a victim, but as someone who had fought for them. And that changed everything. I wasn't just reclaiming my own dignity, I was teaching them to never surrender theirs. One evening, I sat on the edge of my bed, brushing my daughter's hair as she hummed a soft tune. I realized something then. The nightmares that had plagued me for years, the dreams of being left behind, unheard, invisible, were gone. For the first time in my life, when I closed my eyes, there was peace, a fragile, tentative peace, but real all the same. Justice hadn't erased the scars. It hadn't given me back the childhood I lost, or the years wasted on people who never truly loved me. But it gave me something more valuable, freedom. I looked at my children, sleeping soundly, their breaths even and calm, and I felt it deep in my bones. The sweetest revenge was never about their downfall. It was about our survival, our freedom, our future. And as I turned off the light, pulling the blanket over my kids, I smiled softly to myself. The kind of smile that carried no bitterness, no rage, just release. That night, I slept through till morning. No dreams of failure, no calls echoing in my head, just silence, beautiful, liberating silence. And that was when I finally understood. The sweetest revenge wasn't that they lost, it was that I was free. The decision to cut contact wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I blocked their numbers, silenced their emails, and set my social media to private. For the first time, my phone didn't buzz with demands or guilt-tripping messages. The silence was strange at first, almost eerie, but slowly it turned into peace. My children noticed it too. They no longer flinched when the phone rang. They no longer asked, "Do we have to go to Grandma's again?" The cycle was broken. I began teaching them the word I had never learned as a child. No. At first, it was small, declining an extra chore when they were tired, refusing unfair requests from classmates. But with each no, they grew stronger, their voices firmer. I realized that boundaries weren't just walls, they were gifts I could pass down. If I could give my children the strength to say no, then maybe they'd never carry the scars I did. Late one night, as I scrolled through my phone, I opened a blank account on TikTok. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I finally began typing. I wrote about what it was like to be erased by your own parents, about the night my children were shoved into the basement, about finding strength in silence. I posted it anonymously, expecting nothing. By morning, it had over 1 million views. Comments poured in, people saying, "This is my story too." Strangers thanking me for giving voice to their pain. Survivors of toxic families writing, "I thought I was alone." My chest tightened as I read their words. For so long, I had carried my shame in silence. Now my silence had transformed into a beacon. At dinner that week, I cooked spaghetti with my kids in our small kitchen. My son grated cheese, my daughter stirred the sauce, and we laughed when the noodles stuck together. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The sound of their laughter filled the room, bouncing off the walls of our modest apartment. For the first time, I wasn't pretending. For the first time, it felt like home. And yet, I didn't know that simple post would open a door I never expected. Not long after, I received a message from a podcast host. They wanted me to share my story on an episode about surviving toxic families. I hesitated at first. The idea of speaking aloud, of exposing the most vulnerable parts of my life, terrified me. But then I thought of the strangers who had thanked me online, the thousands who felt less alone because I had spoken. Maybe my story wasn't just mine anymore. The day of the recording, I sat in the studio with headphones pressing against my ears, my heart racing. The host's voice was warm, encouraging. "Tell us what happened," she said. And so I did. My voice shook at times, but I didn't stop. I talked about the late-night calls, the manipulation, the betrayal, and the moment I finally chose freedom. When it ended, I felt lighter, as though every word I spoke loosened the chains that had bound me for decades. Afterward, messages flooded in again, but this time they were more personal. People said my story gave them the courage to go no contact, to stand up, to finally put their children first. And in their words, I found purpose. That night, as I tucked my kids into bed, my daughter wrapped her arms around my waist. She looked up at me with eyes too wise for her age and whispered, "Mom, you saved us." I held her tight, my throat thick with tears. Because she was right. This wasn't just about me. This was about breaking a chain that had strangled generations. This was about ensuring my children would never grow up thinking love meant control or loyalty meant silence. For the first time in years, I lay down in bed and closed my eyes without fear. No nightmares chased me. No voices accused me. Just stillness, healing, freedom. In that quiet, I realized something profound. My parents thought they had destroyed me, that their betrayal had left me hollow. But they were wrong. Every wound had made me sharper. Every betrayal had pushed me closer to the woman I was always meant to become. They thought they broke me, but really, they built the woman I was always meant to be.